Hi, this is Burr Stewart, and in this video I'm going to give you a comprehensive overview of my model railroad called the Burlington Northern. I'm going to show you the track plans, the geographic context of the layout, how I started it in a completely different house and built the benchwork so that I could move it to the current house, show you all the track plan doodles that I went through, some of the signature scenes on the layout, progress photos while we were building, some of the unusual bridge treatments and other things that I've tried, a little bit of paperwork to show how we run the railroad, and various scenery shots. This is a Zoom recording of a presentation I gave to the NMRA back in October, so I hope you'll enjoy it. Welcome everyone, thanks for joining me. I'm going to give you a very focused slideshow on my model railroad, the Burlington Northern. It's a freelanced version of the Seattle region of the actual Burlington Northern, and I picked 1973 to model because that's halfway through the repainting project. So as you can see in the shade here, I just love diesel engines and I didn't want to decide which kind to buy. I wanted to buy them all so this way I could have the maximum amount of fleet. So I want to start by saying there are three quotes that guide my overall thinking about this. First of all, Kent Sullivan famously said after doing a lot of research on photographs that 95% of the photographs are about locomotives. That's what people care about. And I've noticed that's what model railroading is really about too. There's all this stuff around us, but it's really locomotives. This presentation will not be about locomotives. It'll be about the model railroad that they run on, but I thought that was interesting. I often say I never saw a train or track switch that I didn't like, and what you're going to see now is just a lifetime of my own obsession with it. And Scott Calvert in Vancouver famously said, I started out designing my layout, and then at some point it started designing me. And we'll get to that in this presentation. I wanted to start by getting out of the way all the various statistics that you see in the little box in a Model Railroader article of a layout tour. I'm not going to read all these to you, but this is just some of the basic statistics. I'm mainly simply going to show you the layout today. And we're not going to talk about operations and locomotives and many, many other facets of this wonderful hobby. This is the closest thing I have to a track plan. It's an 800 square foot basement, and we'll be touring all around this layout for the next hour. I want to focus on the prototype inspiration, why I'm doing this, the design process that I followed, a station-by-station tour all around the layout, and it says here lessons learned, but really it's just how I keep motivated, what keeps it going. So first I wanted to use Lee Marsh's slide to say that the overall motivation for this layout was James Hill's head of the rake, as he called it. And it was the idea that if he had track going from Vancouver, BC down to Portland, he could send all that traffic back to the East Coast, which was at that time the head of commerce in the country. And Chicago still is the largest railroad city in the world. So we basically are a T, if you will. And that Everett Junction always fascinated me. This is a close-up, and the red circle is what I'm attempting to model. And there are a number of really great model railroaders like Lee Marsh and Bill Sorensen who are doing a similar thing. I'm also motivated by watching them and learning from them. The real railroad situation is a little more complicated than this diagram. This is an older map showing in green the Northern Pacific, and in red the Great Northern, and in orange the Milwaukee, and in yellow the Union Pacific. So we really have four railroads, and in the merger of 1970, Northern Pacific and GN combined, but we still had Milwaukee and Union Pacific. So one of the fun things about my layout is the interchange with those other two railroads. The area that I'm modeling is, what we call Puget Sound country, just from Tukwila up to Bellingham. This is a simpler diagram that I made of it. And as you'll see, one of the problems I have is each one of these dots has one or more yards in it. I don't have anything in Marysville, but Burlington has a yard, Everett, Skykomish, Interbay, South Seattle, and there are staging yards on all three ends. So the layout's out of control, complicated, too many yards, too much track, etc. And you'll see that. But I think the importance of this slide and this diagram is that this idea that instead of building a railroad where I could just go in two directions, north or south, this has 6 directions. You can go all different routes here. And I thought that would just make for more fun running trains, to be able to go different directions, east and north and south. And you can even go west with the barge. We have the barge going to Port Townsend as well. The motivation for the railroad, again, was all of this multicolored, they call it the rainbow era in the Great Northern, before they could paint all the locomotives. These were the typical consists, and I just thought this would be a lot of fun to model. In my youth, I also was a private pilot, and I used to fly out of Boeing Field. I'd rent an airplane and take trips, and this is a picture I took one day in the early 1980s, looking down at the roundhouse in Interbay, and I just thought this was fascinating to figure out. You can see here some look like SD40s or SD40-2s. You have a lot of cars in the yard. This must have been a Saturday that I was going for a flight, and they had a lot of traffic waiting for crews to come back. Over here is a very large car repair shed, which is still in operation. And I just thought, wow, this would be something to model. And then I went rail fanning, and from the local streets, you get a wonderful view of things. I thought it was really cool to see all these wood chip cars snaking through the yard. This is from Emerson Street looking south. Here's that car repair shed. This is looking the same direction a little farther south on a day when there were still some empty tracks. Later, I came back when there was more action, and I saw this series of switch moves, and I thought, wow, what's going on here? We got a switcher pulling some cars out of this side, and fundamentally, it just seemed like a yard that could be fun to model. It didn't help that I was at the time working at the Port of Seattle along the waterfront downtown Seattle, Pier 66, in their headquarters building, and I would look out the window, my third floor window, and see these trains rumbling by. One of the things that fascinated me was that there were a lot of light engine moves. And it would just be 4 engines together would run back and forth, and I couldn't figure out what are they doing running these engines. So my curiosity just got bigger and bigger the more I was exposed to all this railroading. So that's basically what motivated me, was just being obsessed with it. So at the time we were living in Ballard, and we had a single car garage that was available to me. It was too steep to get into it with a real car. I started sketching how could I make a model railroad based on Interbay Yard. So I'm just going to, this is a sketch I just made in a notebook, and you can do this yourself. You don't need a computer program or fancy CAD drawings. You just start doodling. And for the next few minutes, I'm just going to show you some of my doodles. This was my original idea for the schematic. It would go from Interbay to South Seattle staging up to Everett. There would be a branch in Everett, and one branch would go north, and that would be over here, and then another branch would go to the east to the Cascade Summit. And then here's trying to say what would be the grades, the inches above the lowest point on the layout. And then I looked at a multi-level design with a lower level, a middle layer, and an upper level, because I was constrained by this basement. And up here is the doorway into the garage from the house. And see these AA and BB marks here? That's just in order to do a cross-section for elevation. And this is an example. This is what I mean. I could look and see what height was I expecting the track to be along the walls at these different places. And then, is that seem workable? Can I get my hand in there? This doesn't seem like too good a plan to only have 4 inches between 2 tracks. But if I don't need to get in there, I guess it's all right. And I also, of course, had a workbench I needed to work around. So here's a picture of the first Ballard Bridge section. And you can see here, I've already got sort of the 3 decks of the layout happening. And here is a swing bridge that was in the down position, and that came up to a latch. So early in my creation of Burlington Northern, I was obsessed with these bridges that go up and down, and you're mostly familiar with the Rainbow Bridge, and we'll see that later. This was a fast clock I bought at the Boeing swap meet, and I thought that would be fun to play with that with operations. We had young children at the time, so this was their version of a model railroad, I guess. I played with using Formica sheet as a backdrop. It's very thin. It's very hard to saw it, as you can see here, but it does make a nice smooth curve. And this was the first version of the Interbay yard that I built in the first house in Ballard. And what's important about this is I built it out of 4x8 sheets of plywood, and I put a joint in the benchwork. And you can see these are 1x2 joists, but here they're screwed together with the idea that if I ever had to move, I'd be able to move. Now you can see the joint in the plywood is over off center, but the main thing is that the benchwork itself could be moved, and I wouldn't have to start from scratch. So another feature, of course, is how to find out what's going on, and I joined the Great Northern Railway Historical Society as well as the Northern Pacific Historical Society, and came about the Friends of the Burlington Northern Railroad, which is a historical society. And this is an example of the Interbay track diagram from the actual Interbay that D&RGW makes available to its members, as well as all the other yards that are on my layout were based on drawings from the Historical Society. I also picked up the annuals Hull Wagner published in the 70s and was able to find a spins diagram for the Stacy Street yard. This is the handbook that they give to employees to know where things are on the railroad. This is an example of a track chart. I also found this at the Boeing swap meet. Vancouver to Everett, that's pretty good. Concrete to Anacortes, we'll see what that means in a minute. This yard from the Ballard house had the car repair shop over here. It had the main classification tracks that you saw earlier in the prototype pictures, and it had the beginnings of the engine terminal over on this side. So I was just trying to get the feeling of the Interbay yard with my first yard. And these two pictures I'm really getting excited about. I put down some ballast, and I'm starting to switch cars. And the whole idea was you run a train into Interbay, you figure out where the cars need to go, and then a different train leaves. So I got obsessed with operations very early, and it's really the reason it's taken me 35 years to build this layout, is that it's so much fun to play with the trains that it's hard to make forward progress on the construction. But, you know, each to his own. Now, there are a lot of ways you can waste your time. I don't have to tell you about all these, but I'm amazed that I found this when I was doing research for this presentation. I made up a document called the Troublesome Creek Railway Minutes of the Board of Directors meeting on January 10th, 1990. And I'm just going to read to you from the bottom. The director of rolling stock reported on the recent events of significance in his area. The road has added in the past year an SD24 and CB&Q livery, a Milwaukee RS3 and RSD5, and a GN RS1 passenger switcher. He reports that the passenger switcher will need some paint touch-up and Katy couplers before being put in service in and around Interbay during the 50s and 60s. The paint shop manager reported that 2 F9 units had been painted GN colors for use in the 50s and 60s, as well as several wide-vision caboose. The discussion then turned to the acquisition of additional motive power. The superintendent of motivation suggested that we acquire 4 F3 units and at least 5 GP7s. This was met with incredulity by the treasurer. I could go on, but I was just horsing around trying to pretend that we had a board of directors and we were making rational decisions about what to spend and what to purchase and all this. But anyway, there's a lot of ways you can have fun with model railroading. We had 2 young children and decided we needed a bigger house. And what that really means is I wanted a bigger space to build a model railroad. So we found one, and I'm 6'5", so the main criteria for any house we looked at was it had to have a high clearance basement, and this is a very nice high ceiling, and the stairs leading down. So I spent a year or two just tearing all the walls down in the basement, remodeling it, and these are just some shots of the early basement with the 2x2 studs that I put all along the wall, thinking I can hang the layout from this, just like I did with the basement in Ballard. As you probably know, if you've ever done something like this, remodeling a basement is a big job. This house that we bought had already been remodeled once, and this cast iron pipe originally was the sewer from a bathroom above, which no longer existed. So I had to saw this pipe. It originally was in here somewhere, and I had to remove this big cast iron pipe just to make clearance for the model railroad. Just did it with a hacksaw. So I was able to find at the time, this is the early 90s, we didn't really have that much use of personal computers yet, and I found a very simple drawing program, early Macintosh or something. I can't remember now which program this was, but it was just simple. It allowed you to have dots. Each of these dots is a foot. This is the basement. It's about 33 feet this way and about 30 feet that way, 24 feet in the narrow part. And then we had the fireplace chimney and the furnace and these posts that were supporting the entire house, so I couldn't move them. There actually was a post over here, but I was able to move it. So I'm just going to show you some of the fun I had trying to figure out how to build a train layout in this basement. And I'm going to go really through quickly. You can see some of these ideas ended up staying. And of course here on the bottom you can see I was thinking about phase 1 through 7, how would I get this thing built? But I looked at all kinds of possibilities, running a peninsula up here, putting Interbay on a different side, coming in here with a peninsula and a serpentine peninsula. I gave my friends the dimensions, and this came from Carl Robart. He was doodling one day and thought I should do 2 peninsulas coming out like this next to the furnace, which was an odd and interesting idea. This is what might have been the best approach, giving me the most layout. But if I had been doing N scale, I could have really done a serpentine peninsula. And this is just a big smile to crack us up because we're looking at all the different possibilities. Another enormously long serpentine peninsula. What changed everything was we have a 4 by 8 foot N scale layout in the living room, and I started thinking, well, what if we move that down to the basement? We could put it over here, and then we wouldn't have so much space in the peninsula. We didn't actually do that. Barbara got an even better idea, which was to put the ping pong table down there, which is even bigger than a 4 by 8 sheet. But the end result was we decided to keep this area clear, and it was one of the best things that ever happened, because I had no idea when I was building this layout at the time that we would have 12 people coming over here and running trains, and I would need all this space just for people to have a place to be and to, walk with their trains. Here's a kind of a funny doodle in the planning stage. I was trying to figure out if this is going to be a peninsula, should it be approached over here or here? Well, anyway, I'll just keep moving on. It doesn't matter. The point is I was analyzing all these drawings, figuring out the pros and cons, and just continue to press forward. The other thing that got really complicated is figuring out Everett. Everett is really complicated. And I was doodling and doodling trying to figure it out. I finally ended up doing an article in the Layout Design Journal in the summer of 2011 to get everybody else excited about Everett and how complicated and fun it is. But here's the story of Everett. This is the real railroad. It's a double track up to Everett Junction. One track goes through a tunnel and heads off towards Chicago. And there's a Y down there called PA Junction and Lowell that goes into Delta Yard, and then there's another Y up here. So the simple diagram I showed you before is a little misleading. It's not one Y, it's 2. And there's a yard on the water side and there's a yard on the river side called the Delta. And I couldn't figure out what am I going to do, but I knew I had a peninsula, so there was a possibility of having a yard on both sides. But what I ended up doing was putting Bayside on this side with a long, long low line coming around towards it, and then putting Delta Yard on this side with a cutoff at Everett Junction, which isn't shown here, but it's there so that you can run from Interbay up directly to Delta Yard and then head on east, or you can go around to Bayside Yard and then you hit this Y. And so the key to understanding my layout is this Y. It's all about the question of whether or not we're going to go east or we're going to go north. This is the simplified schematic of what the layout turned into, with a double track all the way from South Staging to Mukilteo Everett Junction. And then we have single track up to Bellingham and single track up to Skykomish. And this is essentially the layout. So to make it even easier to understand for operators, I copied this out of the OpSig journal. Somebody had done this. I thought it was really clever. This is just a very simplified schematic showing from the north and east. We have the Skykomish staging and the Bellingham staging, and then we run towards Everett's, Delta, and Bayside yards. We eventually end up in the double track section to Argo, and we have interchanges with the UP and the Milwaukee, and we also have the Harbor Island and West Seattle branches, as well as the Woodinville branch. I'm not going to have time to go into all these branches today, but it's a useful thing to try to simplify your layout. And I'm also not going to even talk about narrow gauge, but I have a narrow gauge extension that goes up the Central Peninsula. Thinking about track plan before we go on to the rest of the presentation of pictures, one way to think about it is Tony Custer publicized this idea of using forks for track planning. You can just put two forks together and you have a double-ended yard. And in my case, it was the Interbay yard in Seattle, heading north and south. Where is that going? Well, it needs to go somewhere, so you have to set up staging. What I ended up doing, if you want to think about it with forks, is, I went from Balmer Interbay yard to Stacy Street yard, where we have the branch to West Seattle. I went to Delta yard and Bayside yard to east staging, and the Ballard branch out of Interbay, the Burlington yard with the concrete branch in Anacortes with north staging in Bellingham, Harbor Island coming out of Stacy, and Argo yard. It's too big of a railroad for one person. I just wanted to show you that you can use forks to do track planning. You don't have to have fancy CAD drawings. That's the main point of this. So now let's do a tour. We'll start at the very south and we'll go all the way to the north. This picture doesn't really show that there's a 7-track staging yard underneath the layout to the right of this southernmost scene here, and this is what we call Tacoma staging. And those trains all come out here on the main line. In this spot in the layout, I also have a stand-in for Lonestar Cement. And I got really motivated when I saw I would drive back and forth to the airport for my work, and I'd see this huge cement plant. It's now called Lafarge, I think, but it was Lonestar Cement at the time. And they had 3 tracks of these short cement hoppers with a loading platform. And I just thought that would be a lot of fun. And so I put in all 4 tracks that the prototype have, and I feel very confident that we're handling the cement loads that are needed by this company. We still haven't built the loading. See, we need to build a roof over this, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it. Then the next thing north is the Argo yard, which is where the UP and the Milwaukee would interchange traffic with the Burlington Northern. And that's a whole nother subject. But anyway, this is the north end of Argo, where we have Royal Brome. And someone seems to have run over the crossbuck here. This is some construction photos earlier in the layout's history. The only thing of importance that's changed is this 3-track yard here above here was the north staging yard, the same one that I had in the Ballard house back in the early 90s. For many years, this was the northern extreme of the layout. And then when we built Burlington, I moved this on the whole other side of the room, and it's now the end. It's a similar thing to what Bill Sorensen's been doing. He's got staging, for the east end. He keeps moving it farther along as he builds the layout. And so if you want to play with operations, you need to keep moving your staging yard as you build the layout. And that's what I did here. So now we're moving on from Argo to Stacy Street Yard. The thing about Stacy Street Yard is I started out originally building it as the South Seattle industrial area. And now it's a full-on representation of Stacy Street Yard, including the Milwaukee barge that goes to Port Townsend, and the grain terminal, which I didn't have room for in Interbay, so I moved it to Stacy because I just had to. But these are some historical shots of how I started out building a big industrial area with a staging yard behind, and that was before I built the Argo and Tacoma staging. So that all worked fine, but then I realized it was totally unworkable to have a yard behind a bunch of high industrial buildings. So we never did really build these buildings. We rebuilt this whole thing to be the full-on Stacy Street yard that you saw there. And then we proceeded through the stairway to the basement into downtown Seattle where the double track main line was. And I mentioned that I worked right down here and used to see a lot of trains going by. And we're still working on the backdrop for this area. But this double crossover is a main feature of the area in front of Pier 69. Even today, as you go down there, you can see trains negotiating this double crossover, and I thought that would be really fun to have on the layout. And then, of course, here's the expanded Interbay yard, the guts of which came from the original house in Ballard. Magnus Christensen helped me by paving this whole area and figuring out a way to do this no parking stencils, just like the prototype photo. I don't think I show that here, but this is the auto loading and unloading area that was at Pier 9091 for many, many years. In the old days, of the early days of the layout, I had the grain terminal here. And you can see here the grain terminal, but it really didn't fit. And I also realized I didn't want to block the operator's view or approach to the switches. So there's always this trade-off between what works for being geographically correct and what's easy for the people running trains to do. And you can see back here, we're just starting to put in some foam scenery. Of course, today it looks much better. This is the middle of the yard. This is the Dravis Street crossing, which is a very popular rail fanning spot. And I have several rail fans taking movies and everything else here. This is the original section of the layout that was ballasted back in early 1990s. And this has been now in continuous use, classifying cars for the Burlington Northern longer than the Burlington Northern Railroad existed as a railroad. It was only in existence for 25 years, but we've been switching cars here for, I don't know, 35 years. Another thing, a feature of this scene is the Bellingham staging area. This is the original 3-track yard that I had back in Ballard, but I added another 2-track ramp so that we could have a continuous run from Tacoma staging all the way back up to Bellingham staging so we can do continuous runs. You can also see I have an enormously cluttered front fascia with all of the car cards, which is one of the problems with car cards. You can also see back here we're still developing the engine terminal with the sand towers and so forth. Here's a view the other direction of the Interbay yard, and this is my imitation of the 3-track car repair shed, again with the engine terminal. There's a company called Time Oil that had a big auto loading rack. This track actually came off of here on the prototype, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. I didn't want to put in a curved turnout, so I approached it from the other end. Dave Enger came up with a brilliant idea. We needed a tank for Time Oil. And we figured, why don't we just cut out for a clearance, because there's a track that goes down here towards the Terry Avenue branch in South Lake Union. We run trains down there. So we just put a we cut a hole in the tank and we run trains through here, but we haven't had an explosion yet. So then as we come out of Interbay, we go across a representation of the huge bridge number 4, Salmon Bay Bridge. It's a lift bridge, but we don't have room for all that, so we just put in a bridge. And this was kit bashed for me by a neighbor, Bob Wickham, who stretched out the width of it so that it could this is a Walther's double-track bridge, but we stretched out the width so we could get 2 trains through there. And then coming around here is the Ballard branch, or the Fremont branch, that was an old GN line, and going into Bardol, which was a very famous old company in Ballard that made additives. You may remember that. And so we serve Bardol and many of the other factories in Ballard that were there in the 70s. This is another shot of the double-track main coming around towards Golden Gardens with the branch coming through. This is a historical shot of that same area. You can see the ping pong table that was Barbara's idea, and it was handy for storing materials as well. This is, during construction. And the main thing I'd say about this is I used a lot of laminated 1/4-inch plywood because I found it very easy to handle, easy to cut, and strong. And if I laminated two pieces together, I got a 1/2 inch plywood piece. I didn't have to have joints because I could have the staggered joints in the plywood and then set it down right on the foam in a lot of areas. This yellow stuff, by the way, is the spray foam, hot stuff or good stuff or something, but it's just a spray insulating foam, but it's a good material for filling in gaps between pieces of harder extruded foam. This is another construction shot early in the process, or maybe it's midway through the process in the 1990s. Of course, here's what it looks like today. It's a double track main line with the branch going down to Ballard. And these are scenic super trees. And we have a continuous run cutoff that we also use as the stand-in for the Mukilteo Haynefield branch, where the aircraft parts go in and out. Here's a picture of the same prototype. And at the time, they had a lot of old retaining walls. These have been replaced in recent years, but I thought it was pretty cool. They just used ties and rail. Here's a friend from California who's an expert in mining, and he really enjoyed running a unit coal train along the layout along this double track main. Again, here's the construction shots along that section as we were building it. And this is the end down there. And I ended up having to expand that, which is the advantage of L-girder construction. Anyway, we come around the corner to Mukilteo and Everett Junction, which now looks like this. The Everett Junction is this very important switch where if you go to the right, you go towards Chicago, which is Delta Yard, and then up around the peninsula. If you go to the left, you take the low line over to Bayside Yard in Everett and go north to Vancouver. And that's the most important thing to understand, really, about the layout. The other thing that's interesting, this is double track here, but this third track should really be two more tracks, something called Milepost Yard, and this is where the prototype would drop off the westbound cars here, and then this is the low line going around to Bayside Yard on the opposite side of the peninsula, and this is the Delta Yard. This is a picture of both the low line and the high line. The high line goes up to Delta. This is the Delta Yard. Against my better judgment, I decided to do a narrow gauge branch which interchanges with the BN in Everett. And I just decided that by the 1970s, the Denver and Rio Grande Western made it all the way across the Cascades to the sea in order to compete with the standard gauge lines. And so we have a turntable here, just a manual turntable, a little narrow gauge yard, and we basically loop around the peninsula several times in several different ways and end up in a very high town, which you can't even see in the picture, which has a reverse loop, so then we can come back down and run the narrow gauge. This is an interchange yard, which works okay because of the geometry. I didn't have room to make Delta Yard much of anything except a holding spot, and also a place to have Weyerhaeuser Mill B. If you're not familiar with Weyerhaeuser Mill B, it was one of the very largest lumber mills in the world at the time that it was built and handled a lot of traffic. So at a minimum, we have to have some lumber coming out of there and logs going in. I was able to get one of the AP certificates by scratch building these three turnouts. This is a curved dual gauge diamond crossing of the main line. And then these are a couple of different types of narrow gauge, dual gauge turnouts that accomplish different combinations of standard and narrow gauge track. This is always fun because I scratch built it, so every time a train goes over here, I'm just biting my nails trying to figure out, is it going to derail? Is it do fine? But it's been doing great. I think I built it about 5 years ago, and now we have better service to Weyerhaeuser Mill B, which is great. Oh, I mentioned those old retaining walls. They just took used rails and held up used ties. And I just thought that would be easy to model. So we have a couple of those along the layout. Just really fun and easy thing to make it look like a railroad. And you can see some of them right down here, those retaining walls. This is a bridge I just put in because I could. There's no prototype for it. And then I don't know how the squid got in the picture, but now we call it the Squid Bridge because the squid's chasing a couple in a rowboat with the kids freaking out on the shore there. This is a log dump, which probably doesn't make sense either, but I wanted to have the logs look like they belong there. Here's a progress photo of that same area from 25 years ago. These are more progress photos, and I was just thinking about the narrow gauge here at this point. And then right around the corner, we have an area that I put a turntable in. I don't know if you really need a turntable for a 1970s layout, but there it is. And then this is our stand-in for Scott Paper at the moment. And you can see all the wood chip cars that I showed you in an earlier picture that are coming into the plant. This is a prototype picture of the Bayside yard, and I just wanted to show that I did the same idea of having the yard next to a hillside. This is a better photo of the yard. There are a couple fine scale miniatures kits here, the freight house and the icing platform, that my friend Andy Dupree built back when we were in high school in the 60s and 70s. They're just parked here because he doesn't have a layout that they belong on. It works pretty well. We have a freight house to spot cars, and you can see down here I have the schematic diagram for operators, and I'll show that picture again, I think, too. Here's a construction photo of that area. Originally it was just 4 tracks, but I added another 3 tracks so that we could be less of a bottleneck. The way that I use this diagram is put a big black dot. If you're in Everett Bayside, you can see that the waybills for these different towns are color-coded. So if it's a warmer color, it goes to the right, and if it's a colder color, it goes to the left. It's just a way of helping people get oriented. I showed you the SPINS booklet before. This is what I did for each town, is to give each track a number. So the waybill will say, you know, this track needs to go to Scott Paper Company, track 2325, and you know to put it on this particular track. I'm not going to get into operations today, but this is the lineup, what's called the lineup of all the trains that are going to come through Bayside Yard or be originated. So we've just gone along the railroad up to this point. And so now we're going to go north to Bellingham, and then we'll come back and go to east, and then you will have gotten a layout tour. This is the most important, you know, Delta Y. When we go to the right, we go to Chicago. This is the same area here. We go to the right, we go to Chicago. We go to the left, we go straight and up to Burlington and Bellingham. This is what happens if we go to the right. We enter Delta Yard, and we go around, and we eventually come out over here on this trestle, and we climb up to Skykomish. And this is an aerial view of the Y, and I was able to put the Skykomish River in the middle of it, so I'd have the feeling that at least when you went north towards Marysville, at least you'd be going over a bridge. This is a photograph of the prototype Delta Y. It has a highway bridge over the top of it, so I thought it was okay to have a railroad bridge over the top of the Y. This is some construction photos of that area. I had just enough room inside this scenic divider to put 2 more tracks. So I went ahead and put staging tracks in there, and we used that for the Renton Rocket and the Darrington Logger, which are 2 trains that need a place to stage. This bridge was built by Lee Twaits from a Campbell kit many, many years ago, and Lee Twaits converted to O-scale, so the Boeing swap meet, he was selling all his bridges and buildings, and I picked this up and didn't have to build it myself. I mentioned earlier that I used to use this 3-track staging yard from the old garage in Ballard as the end of the line, and that was true for a while until we made progress on the layout. You can see it there. Now, the view today is coming across the Stillaguamish Bridge, and then up here the Skagit River Bridge. And so in between is Mount Vernon. I wanted to show this picture partly to say that when you're cramming as much railroad into this much space as I am, you have to make a lot of weird compromises. In this case, I couldn't possibly model the water underneath the bridge because I have this yard right below it. So I thought, I'll just leave out the benchwork altogether, just have the bridge go between 2 pieces of benchwork. And, you know, it works fine. It's a compromise, but you'll see it again in a minute with the Skagit River Bridge. Same idea. And this is a station we shoehorned in there for the Mount Vernon branch, if you will. So there are a bunch of industries hidden, a staging yard for industries for Mount Vernon. This is the Skagit River Bridge crossing. I did the same thing there. I didn't want to really interfere with the lower level, so I just put in an L bracket and what looks like a concrete pier. And it's good enough. It works great. It's fun to have a big bridge like that to go across, even if there isn't scenery underneath it. I wanted to have a rock train of limestone ore jennies, so I ran a track into the corner. This is what it looked like in the early days before I did the rock wall. And mainly what I wanted to point out here is, one is, when you put up the foam, the faster you can paint it, the better, because just throwing on a coat of paint here and blowing some Woodland Scenics grass on it makes it look almost finished, and then you can take your time to get the details in. The other thing I want to say about this is, we made these trees by inviting friends over on Friday nights and having what we call tree parties, and we just sit around and yak with some Elmer's glue and furnace filter, and cut up furnace filter and stick it on the barbecue skewers, and before you know it, we have this huge forest. I calculated one time it took about an average of 5 minutes per tree to make these things, and spread over a workforce of 6 people having a party. And it's one way to create a forest, and this realistic forest was one of the highlights of the layout for many, many years. And then we get to Burlington, which is one of my favorite places, a prototype yard that has so many great features. It's only 5 tracks, and it serves both the concrete branch up in the mountains and the Anacortes branch that has a port and refineries and so forth. It's a lot of stuff. Here you can see the oil cars for the Anacortes refineries on the left, and way back in the back is where the concrete branch is. And this is the tracks that are laid out very similarly to the prototype. Looking from the other end, this is the Anacortes branch again. The piece of balsa wood here represents the Bo Edison Foods, which is one of the food processors. They freeze a lot of berries and things like that up there. I got this picture of Mount Baker from a poster at the University of Washington bookstore and just glued it on the backdrop, and so everybody has an idea that we're near Mount Baker. This is what I think was the track plan. This has been extensively reworked. In the modern day, what used to be the concrete branch is now a link to the Sumas branch that goes up to the Canadian border. This is an aerial view. There's a factory on the concrete branch. This up here is the concrete branch, and Northwest Olivine was a factory that mined very fine sand out of the river, and that sand was actually used in the Interbay roundhouse for engine sand. So we have a actually legitimate online transfer from Northwest Olivine down to the engine terminal. Back to the fork business. After I got the Burlington yard built, I think it was Joe Green was here for an operating session one time, and it took him 6 hours to work the Burlington yard, and he had a blast. And I just thought, wow, this Burlington yard would make a perfectly good model railroad all by itself. You don't need all the rest of the stuff in the basement. And just look at this. I mean, this is my spins diagram. I have all the track numbers and what company they are. There's a lot of switching to do in the concrete branch, a couple of tracks in Mount Vernon, a couple yard tracks to work with, and by the time you figure all this out, you've had fun for hours and hours. This would make a complete model railroad, just this one section of the layout. Moving on, I was incredibly fortunate to be the first one that asked Paul Scoles what he was going to do with the module that he built for the book that he published on realistic scenery, and he said he was going to throw it in the dump. So I said, no, you're not. You're going to give it to me, and I'm going to put it on my layout. So now I have this absolutely gorgeous piece of Paul Scoles art heading north from Burlington across the Samish River, and then another one of these lift bridges. This is, of course, the stairs down into the basement, so I had to have an easy way to just pop it up and pop it down. We haven't driven a locomotive across the opening yet, but I keep my fingers crossed. I need to install some kind of a detector that would block the track, so that would be physically impossible. Another thing I really enjoyed was designing these 2 forests so that when I pick this up, these trees that are on the lift bridge don't interfere with these other trees. Isn't model railroading crazy? The things you get involved with. How can I merge these 2 sets of trees? So here's the line heading up to the Bellingham staging track, and that's along the top wall. Here's a better shot of the 3 tracks in the Bellingham staging, and 2 of them go around the corner into the scene in the back of the room. You can see the 2 cabooses here. These are in Bellingham, but this track here is the index loop heading up to Skykomish. So what can I say? So now we're going to quickly go up to Skykomish. We just went north. Now we're going to go east, and I don't have room to do. There are a lot of really cool things you could do going east. There's Gold Bar, Sultan, on and on, which I'm going to let Bill Sorensen do that on his layout. But all I really can do here is leave the Delta yard and go around the corner, as you can see here, and then head up the side of the hill in between Bayside Yard and the narrow gauge Empire, and then cross the steel trestle above the Delta Y. And here's just a picture of that Nason Creek Bridge, which I'm kind of imitating here. And then across this skewed bridge, and I don't know if any of you have noticed along Highway 2 when you're going up towards Stevens Pass, there's a really cool skewed bridge. And I can't remember if it's the highway is on the skew or the railroad track. I have a feeling it might be the highway, but anyway, I just decided I was going to have an intensely skewed bridge, and so that's what this is. And of course it was needed because we had a track down here which was going up to Woodinville, and so we needed to get it on the other side. And then we come around a corner where I plan to build a trestle. I just wanted to point out that it's hidden behind some trees, and nobody would ever know that there's no trestle there. It's just a 1/4-inch piece of plywood with a couple of dowels supporting it. And nobody's ever cared or complained about this because they can't see it. It's behind these trees. And we'll eventually get it built and maybe thin the trees out so we have another beautiful bridge. But it's just a question of this big a layout. You have to constantly make compromises and put things off and do tricks to have things look a certain way or look like they look a certain way. Anyway, then the track goes along this steep hill. And of course, to the right down here is the double track main we saw by Carkeek Park. And above this is the Skykomish staging yard. And the Skykomish staging yard is all removable because below this is the Tacoma staging yard. So I had to have this removable. And if you look hard, you can see some little blue foam peeking out here because it isn't quite right. But that's because this section of scenery is all removable. And I could do a whole clinic on removable scenery. I think I may have done that already. We'll do it again sometime. But removable scenery is a really important thing to think about. And I also wanted to show you can use a commercial casting to make a rock wall, or you can just put Sculptamold down or lightweight spackle. I just put lightweight spackle here and made notches. It kind of looks like I did this with a... It doesn't exactly look like, but it's close enough. That's the point. And this is another thing that Dave Enger and I tried to figure out. He's a civil engineer, and we were trying to figure out what we could do to make this look like a reasonable gap. We put a girder in here. We still haven't figured out how to support the girder, so it's just kind of hanging. And there's no girder on the other side. But anyway, the point is it's an optical illusion that there's a bridge over this track. And, you know, when you're up here, you don't care about that girder. So then after you go under there, we come around the index loop, and I was lucky enough that my son had artistic talent, so he painted this over a photograph of the actual Mount Index. This was the loop before we got the backdrop painted and everything. This is what I was telling you about, staggered joints with 1/4-inch Luan plywood, that's what they call it. Oh yeah, this is a picture of the actual Mount Index and my son's rendition of it, which turned out really, really well. And then it comes around, there's the Mount Index again, but we have a track coming down from Bellingham to provide a cutoff, and we have this track, so the clearance here is very, very tight, but it just worked out for us. Again, we couldn't figure out what to do to make this realistic and have room down here, so we just stuck a rock casting in the middle of the air. And when you're driving a train along here, you don't care. You're looking at the track. You're looking at the engine. So it worked out really well. And then we come around finally the corner to Skykomish Yard, which is the easternmost end of the layout. And in the very far corner, you can see the arch there of the Rainbow Bridge. And that's a hinged bridge which we can pull down and turn a train around. So we have a teardrop return loop at the end so we can reposition the trains as needed. I also put in a couple of tracks above that to represent the Milwaukee's limestone junction branch. This is an early construction shot. For many, many years, I just had 2 tracks here, but that was enough. We could have, you know, we could send one train east, and we could have another one come from the east, and we did that for many years. This is the current scene again, and what it looks like today. I just love this view of all these engines, motive power. And of course, after we've operated for 20 hours with 10 people, it looks like this with all the cabooses on the back and the engines the other direction. And this is a typical operating session where we have a bunch of people in the room, and the yards can get really tied up. It's a lot of fun to try to keep the traffic rolling. You can see all the tracks are heavily in use here, as well as we've got so many engines that have been brought into the yard that we had to put some of them on the ground. I just wanted to illustrate that. This picture is from a few years ago, because now all this has been ballasted and looks a lot better than it did. And some of you may know that during COVID, we had couple virtual ops where we had people run the trains remotely, and we were able to use the cutoff that I mentioned between Bellingham and Skykomish to have a continuous loop. I don't know how long it is, about 400 or 500 feet long, that we could run. So this is another way of thinking about the layout. It's basically connections between, 7 yards. And, my question to you is, could this be too many yards for 1 mile railroad? I'll let you decide that. But I do have sort of the question of when will it ever end? This is a picture I took the other day of Robin and me demolishing a layout on Orcas Island, which unfortunately had to be taken down, but we'll worry about that some other day. So what's kept me motivated over the 35 years? A lot of different things on this list. Obviously, rail fanning, and my wife appreciates me being at home is really important, so she encourages me to play with trains rather than go golfing. And making YouTube videos really makes me want to make the layout look better. I read to you from one of my earlier journal entries, but when I keep a log of what I'm doing, a written log, it makes me feel like I'm doing something that's important, that I'm keeping track of. There are new products coming out all the time. I'm just amazed at the friends that show up and want to help. And a lot of the progress I've made in the last 5 years has been done by other people that have just come over to help. And I do a tremendous amount of reading of magazines and historical societies. And I guess the way to summarize it is, the more you learn about something, the more interesting it is. And your brain is just wired like that. This is some of the people that have helped, just a small number of them. I wanted to mention Dave Strombaum, who now lives in Mexico, but he took some photographs that I had taken of the Interbay yard, and he painted this backdrop from the photographs, and it's a beautiful thing. And then I mentioned my son did some all the good mountains he painted. And Eric Van Nuys is really into rock castings, and he did a number of the good plaster rock castings. And this is my friend Andy Dupree from high school, and he lives in the Seattle area and comes over and does things occasionally as well. And of course, he's contributed his buildings. And I have to mention, Barbara got excited. My wife wanted to build the skirts all around the layout, which you may have seen in some of the pictures, and that's her working away on that. So what's to come? What's on the horizon? We're about to build a Milwaukee Road engine terminal in the corner, and we're also going to remodel Lego Town into Harbor Island. And then past Lego Town, there's a trestle which needs to have this bridge installed. It needs to be a lift bridge. That's the bridge to West Seattle. And then, of course, we're going to make a steel mill in West Seattle and all that. Well, you can see the beginnings of the steel mill right here. This is a building that came from Walt Apple, and he didn't need it anymore. And so I parked it here. And we now have rebar coming out of the electric arc furnace in West Seattle. And this service is now active. So we can ship you some rebar if you have a construction project. This bridge here on the narrow gauge line was recently built by Robin Peel. And we're going to take this line another 8 feet off to the right and build another mine over there. So we're going to have lots of fun operating the narrow gauge and bringing stuff down to the standard gauge interchange. We're also continuing to work on these sand towers and getting Interbay really finished. So that's my layout tour. I did the best I could to not talk about 14,000 things. And I do want to mention that if you haven't seen my YouTube channel, it's worth looking at. I have several hundred videos of all sorts of aspects of trains running on the layout. And today we haven't been able to see any trains running because I wanted to give you a layout tour, but you're welcome to enjoy the YouTube videos.